Listening, fill in the blanks.
Let's start.
Gerhardus Mercator, the foremost shipmaker of the 16th century, developed a technique of arranging meridians and parallels in such a way that navigators could draw straight lines between 2 points and steer a constant compass course between them. This distortion formula, introduced on his world map of 1569, created the Greenland problem. Even on some standard maps to this day, Greenland looks as large as South America, one of the many problems when one tries to portray a round world on a flat sheet of paper. But the Mercator projection was so practical that it is still popular with sailors. Ambiguous word choices are the source of some misunderstandings. Scientists often employ colloquial terminology, which they then assign a specific meaning that is impossible to fathom without proper training. The term relativity, for example, is intrinsically misleading. Many interpret the theory to mean that everything is relative and there are no absolutes. Yet although the measurements any observer makes depend on his coordinates and reference frame, the physical phenomena he measures have an invariant description that transcends that observer's particular coordinates. Einstein's theory of relativity is really about finding an invariant description of physical phenomena. True, Einstein agreed with the idea that his theory would have been better named invariant in theory. But the term relativity was already entrenched at the time for him to change.
Global warming is another example of problematic terminology. Climatologists predict more drastic fluctuations in temperature and rainfall, and not necessarily that every place will be warmer. The name sometimes subverts the debate, since it lets people argue that their winter was worse, so how could there be global warming? Clearly, global climate change would have been a better name. But not all problems stem solely from poor word choices. Some stem from the intrinsically complex nature of much of modern science. Science sometimes transcends this limitation. Remarkably, chemists were able to detail the precise chemical processes involved in the destruction of the ozone layer, making the evidence that chlorofluorocarbon gases, Freon, for example, were destroying the ozone layer indisputable.
For all the power of the biomimetics paradigm, and the brilliant people who practice it, bioinspiration has led to surprisingly few mass-produced products and arguably only one household word: Velcro, which was invented in 1948 by Swiss chemist Georges de Mestral, by copying the way cockleburrs clung to his dog's coat. In addition to Kutkowski's lab, 5 other high-powered research teams are currently trying to mimic gecko adhesion, and so far none has come close to matching the lizard's strong, directional, self-cleaning grip. Likewise, scientists have yet to meaningfully recreate the abalone nanostructure that accounts for the strength of its shell, and several well-funded biotech companies have gone bankrupt trying to make artificial spider silk.
What is the point of defining levels of happiness and classifying the virtues? Aren't these concepts vague and impossible to pin down? Can you justify spending funds to research positive states when there are problems such as famine, flood, and epidemic depression to be solved? Seligman knows his work can be belittled alongside trite notions such as the power of positive thinking. His plan to stop the new science floating on the waves of self-improvement fashions is to make sure it is anchored to positive philosophy above, and to positive biology below.
Last year, a global consortium of scientists led by Frisson announced plans to sequence the banana genome within 5 years. It would be the first edible fruit to be sequenced. Well, almost edible. The group will actually be sequencing inedible wild bananas from East Asia because many of these are resistant to black sigatoka. If they can pinpoint the genes that help these wild varieties to resist black sigatoka, the protective genes could be introduced into laboratory tissue cultures of cells from edible varieties. These could then be propagated into new, resistant plants and passed on to farmers.
The faulty notions presented in these theories began with the racist assumptions of Thor Heyerdahl and have been perpetuated by writers, such as Jared Diamond, who do not have sufficient archaeological and historical understanding of the actual events which occurred on Easter Island. The real truth regarding the tremendous social devastation which occurred on Easter Island is that it was a direct consequence of the inhumane behavior of many of the first European visitors, particularly the slavers who raped and murdered the islanders, introduced smallpox and other diseases, and brutally removed the natives to mainland South America. Synthetic dyes suffer from a serious drawback, however. Neural tissue is composed of many different cell types. Estimates suggest that the brain of a mouse, for example, houses many hundreds of types of neurons plus numerous kinds of support cells. Because interactions between specific types of neurons form the basis of neural information processing, someone who wants to understand how a particular circuit works must be able to identify and monitor the individual players and pinpoint when they turn on, fire an action potential, and off. But because synthetic dyes stain all cell types indiscriminately, it is generally impossible to trace the optical signals back to specific types of cells.
Depleted uranium is highly valued by the military, who use it in the tips of armor-piercing weapons. The material's high density and self-sharpening properties help it to penetrate the armor of enemy tanks and bunkers. Its use in conflicts has risen sharply in recent years. The UN Environment Programme, UNEP, estimates that shells containing 1,700 tons of the material were fired during the 2003 Iraq War. Some researchers and campaigners are convinced that depleted uranium left in the environment by spent munitions causes cancer, birth defects, and other ill effects in people exposed to it. Governments and the military disagree, and point out that there is no conclusive epidemiological evidence for this. And while they acknowledge that the material is weakly radioactive, they say this effect is too small to explain the genetic damage at the levels seen in war veterans and civilians.
Like, share, subscribe the channel, and press the bell icon for further updates.